Hello everyone. Today I am speaking with Dr. Anil Seth, a British neuroscientist and professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience at the University of Sussex. He is known for pioneering research into the brain basis of consciousness and is a leading proponent of materialist explanation of consciousness. His widely acclaimed book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, was an instant bestseller and named Book of the Year by several prestigious publications. Expect to learn about the nature of reality, consciousness, the concept of self, why brains don't passively receive reality but participate in the construction of it. You will also see a lot of references to Descartes, who's the author of the famous quote, "I think, therefore I am." This was probably one of the most interesting conversations that I have had thus far. Anil was kind enough to dedicate his time despite feeling a little unwell. I have more conversations coming soon on topics like neuroscience, philosophy, consciousness, World War II, logic, rationality. I also have solo episodes where I summarize and analyze Aristotle's politics. If you enjoy these discussions, please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Leave a like, a comment, or a review. It helps a lot as I grow this platform. And if you would like to reach out to me directly, you can DM me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. Now, here's my conversation with Dr. Anil Seth. I hope you enjoy it. So there's this famous quote by Descartes, "I think, therefore I am." And in your book, you mentioned this interesting correction. You say, "I predict myself and therefore I am." What do you mean by that?
Well, it's not, I wouldn't presume to correct Descartes. Descartes said what he'd said for very good reason, but he said it as a way of trying to isolate what is beyond doubt and what might be kind of fundamental to the nature of being a human self. And I suppose in my work is a lot of it has been pushing back against the idea that what is essential to selfhood or to mind in general, the Descartesian idea that what is central is some kind of rational, immaterial essence of mentality. I think minds are much more deeply embodied in bodies and embedded in worlds. And what gives human minds and animal minds their distinctive contours, I think, can be best understood by thinking about a more fundamental duty of the brain, which is to keep the body alive and to infer the causes of the sensory signals it gets more generally. And as part of that, the way brains do that, this is the kind of more detailed claim under the hood, is that the brain, in my view, is always making predictions about the causes of sensory signals and using sensory data to update those signals. And the working hypothesis I have is that everything that we experience can be understood as a sort of variation on that theme of the brain making and updating predictions about what's going on in the world or what's happening in the body.
Is this the bottom-up approach that you mentioned in your book, where you read like your brain first makes predictions about the external environment and then you receive the data and then makes a correction? So could you please explain a little bit about that idea for the listeners who might be hearing about this for the first time?
Yeah, it's an old idea. It goes back in psychology at least 100 and something years, and in philosophy a lot further. I think the easiest way to explain it is with a contrast to what you might call the naive realist view of how sensation and perception works, which is that there's just this world out there and it has all these properties like colors and shapes and so on. And you open your eyes and the world just pours itself directly into your minds. And there's then, you can think about it, decide what to do, and so on. But to the extent the brain is working to shape our experience, it's happening in this kind of outside-in direction where sensory signals are read out by the brain that originate in the world. Now, of course, what we perceive is highly dependent on the sensory signals that we get. But the core of the idea here is that the content of our perception isn't a sort of outside-in readout of sensory signals, but rather an inference about their causes. And this is where this sort of whole top-down approach comes in. Formerly, this view of perception which Hermann von Helmholtz talks about in the 19th century, but again goes further back, goes back to at least Kant, is that the brain is trying to do some kind of Bayesian inference about the sensory signals that it gets. What's its best guess about what's out there in the world based on noisy and uncertain sensory inputs? And it turns out to be very difficult to actually do optimal Bayesian inference, but a good approximation to it can be achieved if the brain is constantly making predictions and updating these predictions based on sensory data. That's a good way for the brain to approximate this ideal state of inferring what's going on. And so this does mean that there's this continuous cycle of prediction and calibration of these predictions. You can think of it that way too, through sensory data. It's difficult to ask what comes first because it kind of depends where you start. I mean, this cycle is going on and on. But one of the things we're interested in our lab is dissecting this process as much as we can. And it turns out, of course, as always in science, more complicated than one might think. So it's already a little bit counterintuitive because it's already turning on its head this kind of idea that we just receive the world passively through our senses. Instead, the idea now is we actively construct it, or our brains actively construct it. But then there are other elements of the process too. Like when you walk into a room for the first time, you kind of experience the overall context very quickly, that you're in a room with people. But it might take a longer to experience the details. Who's in the room? What's in the room? And one of our current projects is trying to understand the nature of this really rapid gist perception in terms of the same kind of process. And where we're coming to here is actually here, the brain might be predicting things in this bottom-up, outside-in way. So the more you look, the more interesting it gets. And the more I think we get underneath the idea that the brain just passively receives the world as it is. No, it constructs it, but it constructs it all sorts of interesting and different ways.
So brain as more of a writer, not just a reader. Maybe that would be interesting analogy to make here. You're not just reading sensory data, but you're also constructing reality. So what kind of assumptions are baked into that theory?
Well, there's an assumption about what perception is for. That perception is, in this case, not necessarily for creating the most accurate picture of objective reality, but constructing the most useful representation, which depends on what you mean by useful. Useful for immediate behavior is kind of different, but related to useful in the sense of helping the organism persist over time. I think the core assumption in my take on this idea, and it's something that's difficult to test in practice, is the idea that what we perceive is conveyed by this Bayesian inference rather than by the bottom-up sort of sensory signal being read out. Now, this assumption may turn out to not be true, in all cases, or require nuancing, because it may be in some cases the bottom-up signals actually convey what can be thought of functionally as a prediction. But there's certainly an assumption about how this process relates to conscious experience, is that what we experience are the top-down, calibrated predictions rather than the readout of the sensory signals themselves. So it's an assumption, but the hope is it's a sort of testable assumption rather than just something that you've got to sign up to and then forget about.
And how would we be able to test it?
Well, this is where it does get tricky, but to some extent we can use behavioral experiments where we can just give people different expectations, so we can basically set up their brain so it has different predictions, and then we can sort of see how that affects what they consciously experience. But really, to test these things properly, we need to look inside the brain and use brain imaging to link these behavioral experiments with recordings of neural dynamics. And this is happening. We do some of it, but a lot of this requires techniques that we don't have in my own lab, maybe animal research where you can record greater precision from different parts of visual cortex. Ultimately, it's a combination of psychology, of neuroscience, and a dose of philosophy in there as well.
I think what you said there was particularly interesting regarding the perceiving the world as useful. I think you also mentioned this in the book. We perceive the world not as it is, but as it is useful for us. Like someone might ask, like, what's the difference? If you can't perceive the reality as it is, then of course it's not useful. Let's say train is coming to hit me, and uh, usefulness here is that like the train exists, and that's why it's useful for me to identify the reality as it is now, not necessarily as it is useful.
Yeah, I mean the two things overlap in many ways, and that you gave a very good example. So I sometimes another slogan I've used for better or worse for this kind of idea is perception as a controlled hallucination. And so often people have said, well, if you think perception is a controlled hallucination, then you're going to be in danger from trains and buses and all kinds of things which really exist. And my response is always, well, the control is just as important as the hallucination in this. So I'm not saying that perception should be divorced from objective reality, but the idea that accuracy or that maximizing accuracy always maximizes utility, I think is just demonstrably not the case, and it's not the case for a bunch of reasons. I mean, one reason is one good example is color. So we experience a world where color is very important in guiding our behavior, and not just for aesthetics, but for helping us navigate the visual world. But when we see colors, we don't see things as they really are in objective reality. We see both less than what's really there because our eyes are only sensitive to 3 wavelengths. And these wavelengths are just different wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. Out of those 3 wavelengths, we experience millions of colors. So with color, we see both less than and more than what's really there. I think that example is useful because it tells us that seeing what's really there is not even a coherent benchmark. What would it mean to see what's really there in the domain of color? Now, when it comes to the train example, yes, of course, my perceptual apparatus should convey the fact that this very solid, very dangerous object is approaching very quickly. And that's an aspect of objective reality that needs to be present in my perceptual best guess. But the train, will still have an appearance in my experience. It will have a color, it will have a shape, its sense of movement through time will have a particular perceptual character. These are all not the universe as it really is. They are inevitably aspects of perceptual construction. And then there are examples where perception might be usefully different from objective reality. Like we might have biases of optimism or pessimism in our perception, which can be quite handy in terms of guiding our survival. And the final example I'll give is the body. So when we perceive the interior of our body, this is a whole realm of perception called interoception. Now, we don't perceive our internal organs as having shapes or colors or places, even though they do. We perceive emotions. We perceive things as going relatively badly or relatively well. And that's what's useful for our survival. So I think that the overall lesson for me is fairly clear. We can never see the universe exactly as it is. It doesn't even really make sense. And so the perceptual character of our experience will always be constructed, and it will be evaluated. Evolution will have shaped these kinds of perceptions so that they are maximally useful for us.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, especially what you mentioned earlier with the color. For example, if you're talking about a chair, there are some, we may distinguish primary and objective and subjective properties. Okay, chair might be beautiful, ugly, out of shape. They depend on how you observe them, what qualities you find interesting. So are you saying that we can also put color in that category? And if we do so, what other like qualities that we usually think of as objective might also fall under subjectives? Like, what is the limit there?
It's a good question. So there are some properties which people agree are mind dependent, right? So money is a good example. Money exists because people believe that certain things are stores of value and other things aren't. But then solidity is an example of something that's not mind independent in this way. The train is a good example. If it hits you, it's gonna hurt whether you believe this or not. Um, and I think a lot of things kind of lie in the middle. So color seems to be more constructed than something like solidity. It's unclear that colors would exist in any way without visual systems. But even solidity, the way we experience solidity, is still a construction, and for me, that's the key point. So there is an interesting and important distinction between things that are mind dependent versus mind independent, but their appearance. So a chair, again, yeah, chairs exist in a way, but there's a sort of again a long argument about whether the extent to which chairs exist in a mind independent way. In philosophy, again, Wittgenstein talks about this endlessly, right? And then is it just sort of particular bits of wood organized in a particular way and so on? I don't really want to get lost in all those philosophical games, language games. Chairs exist in the sense that if I throw one at you, it's going to hurt if it hits you, even if you don't believe it or see it. But our experience of it as a chair, as something you can sit on, as something that fits in a particular category of objects, that's something that's going to have elements that are constructed socially, psychologically, cognitively.
Even when I was reading your book, even now, like this always goes to, like I keep thinking about Plato and his theory of ideas when he says, there's like a perfect cat out there, but what you may perceive is just a copy of that perfect cat, same as the chair, same as table, same as any other properties. So how much your work like is differs from, let's say, Descartes and Plato, and what you build upon versus how you differ from that, if you can briefly explain.
Well, I think the aspect of Plato that I tend to think of as most relevant is really his allegory of the cave, rather than necessarily the Platonic form. So, the allegory of the cave in Plato is when prisoners are trapped inside a cave, and all they see are shadows on the wall of the cave cast by fire, and they have no direct access to what's going on outside the cave, but they can infer it because of the shadows. And so for the prisoners, the shadows become the real world. And so I think there's a direct line from that allegory to thinking about the brain trapped inside the skull, rather than prisoners in a cave trying to figure out what's going on. So Plato, in this sense, is an antecedent of Kant and of then Hermann von Helmholtz in psychology, and up to the present day. As for Platonic forms, I have to say I don't really have a strong view on that. I don't think it's necessary to come down either way about the existence of Platonic forms or their influence on our perception. If the brain constructs a category of cat, it can probably do so in a very data-driven way over evolutionary and developmental time. When we see this, we kind of see existence proof of this kind of thing in machine learning algorithms these days, where they can bottom-up construct categories that are useful in some ways. They're not error-free, of course. So I don't know. I don't think that the Platonic ideal has enormous relevance for these things, but it's something worth thinking about.
Yeah, we started deep diving into some of these theories already, but if we go back a little bit to also give our listeners some intro about what we're dealing with here. So in your book, you make this beautiful distinction between hard problem of consciousness versus real problem of consciousness. What do you mean by that distinction?
So the essence of the distinction is kind of to encourage researchers and people interested in consciousness to think in a slightly different way that's actually more reflective of most of the work on consciousness that's going on, and that has been going on for ages, long before I sort of talked about it in these terms. The hard problem has one of its references would be Descartes. Again, hard problem is this idea that on the one hand we have mental phenomena, and in particular conscious experiences, and on the other hand we have physical material phenomena like brains. And there is this question about how these two domains relate. And the seeming impossibility of a sensible answer to this was the sort of origin point for dualism in philosophy of mind, that there's two realms and got to figure out how they interact somehow. And the hard problem crystallizes that worry in the particular case of conscious experience. And this is David Chalmers' way of putting it, that we know that consciousness is intimately related to physical processing in the brain and the body, but we don't know how or why this is the case. And so sort of explaining how and why consciousness exists at all in terms of explanations constructed in terms of physical material stuff. That's the hard problem. And when you put it that way, it really is a hard problem. People can make hypotheses about it, but it seems very difficult. It is hard. The real problem has a different sort of origin, which is attempts in history to understand life. And just as there's a hard problem of consciousness now, there was something like a hard problem of life about 150 years ago, where there was resistance to the idea that the property of being alive could be explained in terms of physics and chemistry, that it had to be some other thing going on, something perhaps beyond science as it was then known, something supernatural, some spark of life, élan vital, whatever you want to call it. But of course, the story of our understanding of life hasn't sort of tackled this hard problem of life. We haven't found the spark of life or demonstrated that life doesn't exist. We've just explained properties of living systems in terms of physics and chemistry. And that's become the various branches of biology, and especially where biology meets physics and chemistry on the one hand and psychology and neuroscience on the other. And so this hard problem of life didn't get solved, it got dissolved and is getting dissolved. And that's, I think, the most productive way to think about our ongoing attempt to understand consciousness. If we bash our heads directly against a hard problem, perhaps it's not so surprising that it doesn't seem like we're getting very far. I think we are getting somewhere, and I'm glad some people are doing this, because it is still a big challenge. We don't know what the hard problem of consciousness will look like in 100 years. We don't have the benefit of that kind of hindsight yet. But instead of taking that as the only problem in consciousness research, I'd like there to be a kind of division of labor. And in fact, many people do just say, okay, what are the properties of conscious experience? Both what does it allow us to do and what does it feel like? What are the experiential, phenomenological properties? Can we begin to account for those in terms of now not just physics and chemistry, but biology, neuroscience, cognitive science? And if we can, then the hard problem may start to dissolve. And I'd go a bit further. I'd say it already has. I think the hard problem looks less hard now than it did 30 odd years ago when Dave Chalmers was first on the stage popularizing the idea.
So I guess that it is also a commonly known distinction, let's say, between extreme philosophy at one end and then science. Extreme philosophy, you would like bash your head and say, okay, why do we have consciousness in the first place? Why do we have it? Why the world exists? But in scientific level, you are just focusing on, okay, we have the consciousness. Maybe we don't understand why do we have it in the first place, but let's explain what functions does it have, what role does it serve, and where does it go, where does it emerge, and so on. So it's more like a hardcore scientific way of looking at it, empirical.
I mean, yes and no. I think both extremes are the wrong places to place your bets. I think all the interesting, especially when it comes to something as confusing as consciousness, because consciousness is unique among mysteries in many ways. It's private, it's subjective, the data are harder to get, it's necessarily indirect. I don't know what you're experiencing, I can't know it without some indirect expression about it, what you tell me, maybe some other, how you behave in an experiment and so on. So there are many things which make consciousness distinctive, and most of those things make it also more difficult than other problems. So we can't just kind of turn the wheel of science. Not that was ever a thing in any way. We need a healthy mix and interaction of both. And one of the joys for me of working in this area for the last now more than 20 years is that that's really begun to happen. And that I think there's been this beautiful um, development of a community of philosophically aware neuroscientists and scientifically literate philosophers. And of course, when you have that cross fertilization, then you ask different questions, and when you ask different questions, you get different answers.
Yeah, I think it's great. Even in your book, when I read it, you make a lot of references to Kant, Descartes, Plato, allegory of cave, and so on. So
But
two ideas.
it's not just, but importantly, it's not just like philosophers of the past, right? I think present day, I think the more important thing for me is that philosophers working now, and especially philosophers being trained now, have this fluency. So in my lab at the University of Sussex, I have a philosopher, Robert, just cure within the lab. And that's for me. This is a wonderful thing. So that I've also got a mathematician and a physicist and a neuroscientist. So for me, it's these are the kinds of pieces that need always to be in interaction to make real progress.
Yeah, I guess only recently we have this distinction between philosophy and science, whereas before science was basically called natural philosophy. So, like, if you ask, like, who was Isaac Newton, he would say, I'm dealing with natural philosophy. So,
That's right. That's right. It's a relatively recent. It's a very important development in the scientific method. Don't get me wrong. I think the scientific method has been one of the keystone achievements of modern civilization. It allows for the cumulative development of practical knowledge, unlike anything else. But that doesn't mean that to the extent science is successful, it's increasingly divorced from philosophy. No, I think depending on the area, the interaction becomes actually tighter the more you know scientifically.
okay, two radical ideas. Consciousness as a tragic misstep in evolution versus consciousness as a necessary mechanism for survival. So, as an ignorant person myself, and as an amateur podcaster, so before I read your book, I was more on the first side. Consciousness is a tragic misstep. You don't really need a consciousness to survive. Just be strong in the nature, get the food, find the cave, survive, and that's it. But to me, it seems like you argue more on the second point, that consciousness is a necessary step for like the stepping stone for evolution. Am I right with that conception, or could you correct me if I'm wrong?
Well, I think it's interesting that two things can be right at the same time, and of course it depends how you look. So with conscious experience comes both everything that we value the most. Imagine a universe without any conscious experience at all. Nothing would mean anything. There would be no pain, no pleasure, no joy, no awe, no. And there may be other species out there in the universe that have completely different kinds of conscious experiences. But there would have to be some kind of conscious experience for anything to have any meaning. So with that in mind, I mean, I think we should celebrate the fact that consciousness exists. Maybe it didn't have to. Maybe the world or the universe could have rumbled along its deterministic or stochastic tram lines without there being anything it is like to be anything at all. We need to recognize how precious a thing, a process consciousness is. But that doesn't mean that it's fun to be a conscious creature, right? I mean, with consciousness comes the capacity to experience suffering, to experience pain. And with the kind of consciousness that human beings have, and possibly some other animals, we are also aware of our own mortality. And that's a very specific kind of experiential shadow that casts itself across many of our lives. So yeah, there are downsides, but I think the upside of the possibility for the universe to have meaning is quite a big upside. Now, the second question about whether it's necessary in evolution for the kind of sophisticated behavior that at least some animals have, that's my working hypothesis. Now, it doesn't mean that the things that we do or other animals do that we do because we are conscious can only be done by being conscious. So there's this idea of conscious inessentialism, the idea that just because consciousness is necessary for how we do certain things doesn't mean it's necessary in general for how certain things are done. This is a key point when it comes, as I'm sure we will later, to AI, which can do things which are at least similar to us. But the fact that they can do things that are at least similar to us doesn't mean that they must involve consciousness for the AI, even if they involve consciousness for us as human beings. I think the jury's out on that. And this is partly because we don't yet have a clear enough picture about the functions and mechanisms of consciousness in humans and other animals. But as we get that, I also think it's important to bear in mind that for humans and other animals, it's always a useful perspective to try to understand something apparently resistant to understanding from the perspective of evolution. So consciousness, if we think of it provisionally as a capacity that evolved along with brains and nervous systems, I think we that's the way to get a handle on the functions of consciousness for human beings. And once we've got those, then we can ask the question, are there ways for other systems to implement those same functions without necessarily being conscious in a similar way to, we can now create things that fly without having to have them flap their wings. We understand the principles of flight. We understand the functional role of wings in flying. And so now the design space is wider. Evolution opens up some remarkable regions of design space, but they are still limited compared to the kind of design space that we can have when we've got this kind of top-down view of things.
Yeah, interesting. Since you also mentioned other animals, so there is another interesting idea in your book is this low entropy states, like creatures looking for low entropy states and then creating models of themselves. And in that relation, the concept of self. So it seems that it's not specific to only humans to have this concept of self, because animals can do it as well. They look for their environment and they construct their models based on finding that low entropy state. So could you a little bit explain how that connection works?
So I think the first thing to say is that the idea of having a self is, I think, it's one of these intuitions that you either have or do not have a self, which turns out to be more complex. That the human self has many different components. It's not just like the sense of personal identity. There are experiences of being and having a body, emotion, agency, volition, first person perspective. These are all aspects of self that may be created by specific processes in the mind and brain, and which come together in us in a way that makes us feel that there's just one thing it is to be me or to be you. But actually come together in different ways for different people, and probably in very different ways for other animals. So being a self at its most elaborate levels, like, I know who I am with my individual memories and plans for the future and awareness of the social network around me and the mental lives of others. Maybe that kind of self is reasonably restricted among non-human creatures. But then there'll be more fundamental expressions of self, like emotion and mood, and perspectivalness and volition, which are probably much more common. And they all, I think, stem from this idea that you mentioned, that the fundamental role of the brain is to keep the body alive. That connects in ways which get a little bit into the weeds to these sort of what we call low entropy states, because you can think of a living system as a system that is keeping itself organized for longer than would otherwise happen. Living is the process by which we resist turning into mush for as long as we can. So as a living system is more statistically unexpected. It has this low entropy character. And then the idea is to stay in this low entropy state requires work of some kind. And in physics, this is the sort of physics of open dissipative systems and so on. But in living creatures, we can think about living creatures inducing statistical models of themselves, i.e., their bodies and their environment, in order to keep themselves out of statistical equilibrium with their environment. So these models then become, in my view, the sort of the basic architecture for predictions about sensory signals, which then connect with what we said at the beginning of the talk about all our experiences being forms of perceptual prediction. So now we have, excitingly for me, we've got a kind of a link all the way from perception of colors and shapes and contents of other people's minds right down to fundamental aspects of what it means to be a living creature, a strong connection from mind to life to consciousness. Not a completely seamless one, because there's still a lot of detail in what do we mean when we say that something has a model of itself or of the world, rather than just can be described in those terms. These kinds of questions I don't think are fully answered yet, but I think there's a story there, and that's the story that I try to tell in the book and try to put as much flesh on those bones as possible.
I know we briefly mentioned about this fascinating idea of consciousness as a controlled hallucination, but could you briefly explain that? What do you mean by controlled hallucination?
Well, it really is what we were saying before about perception as this top-down perceptual prediction. So it's just a slogan for describing the contents of our experience as the brain's best guess of the causes of its sensory input rather than the readout of the world. So I used the term, actually the term came, I didn't make it up. I got it. I remember hearing it from seminars years ago, and I think it's been around for a while. Um, when we use the word hallucination, we typically mean a perception or perceptual experience that comes from within, that is generated within the brain. Um, and I like the term controlled hallucination because it preserves that idea of it. But now the idea is all our experiences are actively generated. But normal perception is controlled by sensory signals, as we described, according to criteria of utility and so on. But the difference between hallucination that we might have when we're dreaming or on drugs or, I don't know, hallucinating in mental illness or whatever it might be, the difference between what we would normally describe as hallucination and what we normally describe as perception is now one of degree rather than one of kind.
So we have in one end normal perception, controlled hallucination, and then at
Yeah.
the other extreme we have full hallucination.
Yeah, which you can equally say is uncontrolled perception.
So what happens inside the brain in those stages? So is it the case that when you are fully hallucinating, have you lost all your grip on the data that you're receiving, and it's just your brain making predictions all along?
Not always, and it really depends on the kind of hallucination that is going on. So in one study we did in my lab with Keisuke Suzuki and David Schwartzman, we looked at three different kinds of hallucination and compared them on criteria, including what you just mentioned. So there are some types of hallucination which do seem to be pretty divorced from any sensory input. Um, Hallucinations in Parkinson's disease, for instance, just sort of seem to appear and not have much to do with what's going on in the world. I mean, you could say the same for dreaming, although even sensory signals when we're dreaming can still trigger things in our dreams, though the relation can be pretty indirect. But then other forms of hallucination seem to be transformations of sensory input. Um, so in this case, hallucinations generated by some psychedelic compounds are a bit like this. That depending on the dosage, they might be just transformations of what's coming in. So and this could be another useful handle on this is the phenomenon of pareidolia. So if you look at clouds on a day with like fluffy clouds in the sky, we might see faces in the clouds. Our brains project patterns into things always. So you turn up the dial on that, you start hallucinating. But they're transformations of what's already there. But then other forms, there are some forms of hallucination where indeed they seem to the influence of sensory input becomes very minimal.
Are we eternally limited by the limitations of our consciousness? That is, we can only know what our brain generates as a best guess. So, what's our chance of identifying objective reality if we have any? Seems like there is an objective reality, but we take it as it is useful. It doesn't seem like that we know it as it exists.
And again, there's no reason to expect that, and there's no reason in our everyday behavior to require that either. Depending on your kind of overall theory of what exists, you could say that or a common thing to say is the more fundamental levels in physics exist more than less fundamental levels. So there's a sense in which, okay, it feels like there's a table here, but really they're just atoms, and really they're just quarks, and really they're just like quantum foam or something going on. Of course, wouldn't help us if we perceived reality at that granularity, right? It helps us if we perceive them at the granularity of it being a table. So our perceptual apparatus is fundamentally limited. Just back to the domain of color, there's a fundamental limitation in my brain's sensitivity to the electromagnetic spectrum. Unless I put on glasses of some kind or carry instruments around, I'm not going to perceive ultraviolet or X-rays or anything like that. But this is another view of especially what physics is. You can think of physics as a progressive, centuries-long attempt to overcome the limitations of our own sensory apparatus to peer more deeply into the nature of what's actually there. And as this story unfolds, we see more and more deeply. But of course, physicists don't agree about what's really there either. And we get to some other interestingly irresolvable debates when people talk about interpretations of quantum mechanics. There, it seems like all bets are off about a consensus on what actually exists, even to the extent that, is what's really there a thing or a relation? And I find quite appealing the idea that reality is fundamentally relational at its deepest level. But my point here is that we can have that argument, and I don't think it has all that much relevance to the nature of perceptual experience. There is a constraint on the extent to which our sensory and perceptual apparatus is open to the world, and for the most of the time, that's kind of just fine.
Where do you stand centuries-old free will versus determinism debate?
Well, I think that contrast, that opposition, is the wrong way to put it. I should say, when I wrote the book, Being You, the free will chapters, one of the shorter chapters, was for me the hardest to write, but it was also the one I was most pleased with in the end. So I'd not written academically about free will. I'd argue about it like everybody does, but I'd not actually sort of tried to figure out really what do I think about it. But you can't write a book about consciousness without a chapter on free will. And it's a key part of the self. So I spent a lot of time on it, and the view that I've come to, in a sense, it's part of a class of views called compatibilism. So this is the idea that there's a sensible way to think about free will as existing that is compatible with the universe being deterministic. Doesn't mean that I believe the universe is deterministic. I don't know. Ask a physicist. But I think there are views of free will which basically are okay with it if it is. And so the view that I've come to, it's the starting point was an extension of how we've already been talking about perception. I think I said right at the beginning that the working hypothesis for me is that all experiences are forms of perceptual prediction that have some utility. And if this is right, then this should be the case for experiences of free will as well. But there's another part of our conversation which helps here, which is that the content of what we experience is not necessarily an accurate depiction of what's going on. Colors don't really exist out there in the world, but they're useful for us to perceive. So I think that's that applies to experiences of free will too. Now, what is the content of an experience of free will? It's a bit like yes, I'm causing this to happen now. I'm picking up this bottle of water here now. That content might be analogous to something like the color red. That, yes, it's picking up something real about what's going on in this situation, but it's not what it seems to be. Like, there's no real red out there, and there's no real free will out here if you think of free will as some kind of uncaused cause which swoops in and makes something happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. I think experiences of free will have three basic components. They have the feeling that I'm doing what I want to do, that it's aligned with my beliefs and desires to some extent. Even if I'm being coerced to do something, I'm sort of doing it because I feel I still have to do it. I have this feeling that the action is coming from within rather than somebody, grabbing my hand and moving it for me, self-generated. And I have the feeling that I could have done otherwise. That I did, I picked up this bottle, but I could equally well have not done that or picked up something else. And my contention is that certainly for the last one, that's just not literally true. I couldn't have done something else. I did what I did. I had the brain that I had in the state that it was, and whether it's stochastic or deterministic, I just did what I did. But it's still useful for the brain to perceive this aspect that I could have done otherwise, this counterfactual aspect. And I think that's because the brain is always changing. So that if I do something time t and it turns out badly, then at time t plus one, a similar situation arises, then I might do something different. And there's no spookiness going on here because my brain can have changed. And in the meantime, I could then do something different. And there's no conflict with determinism here either. The universe could deterministically have sort of just rumbled along such that my brain has these experiences and then does, A rather than B at time t, and then does B rather than C at time t plus one. So that's my view of free will. It's the perception, it's the what happens when the brain is making a prediction about the causes of its own actions, and when the brain infers its actions to be, to use Mike Shadlin's term, free from immediate other causes, so more endogenous, when the brain perceives the action as aligned with its own beliefs, desires, and goals, and when the brain perceives the action as plausibly having alternatives that it didn't do, then I think we experience a sense of free will. That's what I think about it.
Yeah, people often say, don't make the same mistake twice. So let's say you made a mistake first, learn from it, and don't make it. But in the second time, its situation is always going to be different. Like how the universe is, choices. There are things outside your control, so it doesn't really always up to you. Are gonna make the same mistake again, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But that's not much comfort, is it? Because you can make a similar enough mistake twice in a row, and it just doesn't help to say, well, the world is actually slightly different this time. Yeah. If you step in a river and almost drown, even though it's a different river and you're a different person, and you step in it again and you almost drown again, that's a sufficiently similar mistake that it's still not a good idea.
You mentioned about this degrees of freedom. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a phrase from Dan Dennett when he's talking about free will. And I think his views on it are the ones that are, in a sense, closest to mine, though he doesn't use this idea of perception to understand the feeling of what an experience of free will is like. But he does point out that creatures like us have many degrees of freedom, a term that he inherits, and so I inherit too from engineering. Some systems have many options for what they can do. Like a train on a track doesn't have many degrees of freedom. It can only go forwards or backwards and maybe at different speeds. A car has more degrees of freedom. It can go down any road. Biological bodies have lots of degrees of freedom. There are many things that we can do at one particular time. And I think so those are the situations where something like this process of inferring the causes of an action and it having this sort of counterfactual could have done otherwise flavor makes sense, because complex creatures do indeed have different degrees of freedom, but these are not freedom from the constraints of the universe or freedom from the laws of physics. These are degrees, varieties of freedom, levels, gradations of freedom in in the affordances, the opportunities for action of the system. So it's a bit of a tricky one. It could be misunderstood as like freedom from, freedom from the laws of physics, and that's what the sort of a lot of the discourse about free will wants to preserve a kind of free will that involves that, that ability to change the course of events and just have something happen that would be different from what the laws of physics would have prescribed, whether they're deterministic or stochastic. And if it doesn't do that, then it doesn't count. And for me, that's a very pointless way to have this debate, because for something to contravene the laws of physics and be a kind of uncaused cause, well, that's a very high bar, and we should try to come up with an account of what experiences of free will are like and what their functional role might be, without either dismissing it completely, or requiring it to have these, almost supernatural properties, a bit like the spark of life again, or consciousness itself. No, let's just be grounded in the world as it is, not as we might like it to be.
Yeah, if we zoom out of everyday lives, look at this from the, let's say, cosmic perspective, it seems like nothing, like the free choices that we have doesn't really matter. For example, let's say you go to you get accepted to university, you lose the job, you get accepted to a job. In a cosmic scale, what does it really change? It's like planet is moving around sun. We know when the sun might explode one day after a few billion years. So it seems like on a cosmic scale, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, well, it's a very humbling thought, isn't it? That, the more you widen out, the more insignificant
Yeah.
any human life becomes, let alone any individual decision. But of course, some decisions can be momentous. We just won't know it necessarily at the time. And, this is part of the challenge of being human, that we've got to reconcile the emotions, the hopes, the dreams, the fears that we all go through in our everyday life with this just incomprehensible vastness of time and space within which we are just the briefest glimmer.
Yeah, maybe in the future we can create a super intelligent AI that can like to change the sun orbit of the earth and everything, and then it will be even more significant. You several times you mentioned about animals, so can we talk about animal consciousness? Can we paint out large landscape about animal consciousness? Maybe few interesting recent research that is available now that tell us more about animal consciousness. Well, like, okay, first let's start. Like, do you think animals can be conscious? Yes or no? Why? Why not?
Well, yes. I mean, we're an animal, we're conscious. And I think we share a lot of the relevant neurobiology with many other animals. Consciousness plays functional roles for us that are also shared, I think, by many non human creatures. So for me, it's, we can never be 100% certain. This is part of the business of science, but and also consciousness being private and subjective, it's always pointed out that, well, I don't even know if you're conscious. I'm just sort of guessing it, really. But I have no doubt, no practical doubt. And the question for non-human consciousness is how quickly the doubt builds up the further away you get from the benchmark human case. And that will vary from person to person, researcher to researcher. It seems, and I agree, there's a widespread consensus now that consciousness is a property that pretty much all mammals will share, or all mammals will share. That's certainly my view. May not be everybody's view, but I think there's very good reasons to think of all mammals as capable of conscious experiences. For me, it gets much harder beyond the mammalian case, because now it's harder to figure out whether non-mammals have the analogs or homologs of the same kind of neurobiological machinery that seem to be important for humans. All this has to be uncertain because we don't have a consensus about the sufficient conditions for consciousness. We have various theories. They would predict different things about which non-human animals are conscious. Some theories associate consciousness with sort of metacognitive, the ability to think about thinking in some way. That might imply that consciousness is more restricted than other theories, which sort of associate consciousness with things like a functional workspace in the brain. which might be more widespread. And then there's evidence that comes from the kinds of things animals do, whether they're suggestive of consciousness in the same way that the similar tests in humans indicate the presence or absence of consciousness. My own zone of uncertainty happens somewhere in the region of fish and insects. Here, I'm just unsure what the fact of the matter is. And there's some, I'm inclined to think that at least some fish and at least some insects have some form of consciousness. But I would not, I don't feel confident about saying all fish and all insects, but then I would also be very challenged to explain to you quite where to draw the line between the two. I think it's a really important, it's a really active area of research as well. With a number of my colleagues, we're thinking a lot about how we can test for consciousness beyond the human, with non-human animals being one of the most obvious contexts where this is both doable. We can adapt paradigms for different kinds of species, and also, of course, massively ethically important. We've, as a species, got a pretty poor track record of, animal welfare and, well, even other human welfare, really, in many, many cases. And, there's some practices going on which may be causing huge amounts of avoidable suffering, like various forms of industrial farming, industrial fishing, these kinds of things. If we can be more confident about the distribution of consciousness in these areas, then this may have really resounding implications for how we decide to live. Whether people, are influenced by these implications or not, well, that's another story. After all, we know we're messing around with the climate. We don't seem to be doing much about that as a society.
Yeah, non-human animal consciousness seems to be also more relevant if we see consciousness as a spectrum rather than off on. Yeah, maybe it's the case that humans are more conscious than animals, but animals may still have some level of consciousness.
Yeah, I think it's another case where it helps to think that consciousness, it's not just one thing. Conscious experience is not just like a single number that can be higher or lower depending on how high up the evolutionary tree you are, which of course is not the right way to think of evolution either. But there are many dimensions along which conscious experience can be characterized. And for us, for human beings, there's a sort of particular way consciousness generally is expressed. So we may have a richer experience over long time periods, for instance, and that's part of the sense of self. So, I can feel the continuity of my selfhood and project out into the future in some ways. But there may be other forms of consciousness which are less rich in human beings than in other animals. Maybe the immediacy of visual experience, or certainly olfactory experience, may be far more impoverished in humans than many species. So I think it's always difficult to defend the claim that human beings are more conscious than other ones. I think we can be differently conscious in ways that matter and that might have ethical and moral significance too, but we've still got to resist this sort of age-old human exceptionalist tendency to put ourselves at the top of every pile, while still recognizing that there may well be distinctive things about human cognition and consciousness that are not present in other animals. And I think you're also right that it doesn't have to be a 0-1 thing. And here again, people often get sort of tied up in confusion about this. I think it's really fairly simple, that it can still be the case that some things have zero consciousness and other things are conscious. But there doesn't have to be a single bright line, in terms of number of neurons or biological complexity or whatever it might be, where if you fall on the other side, you're without consciousness. The analogy here, I think, that's useful is the pile of sand. You can start with no grains of sand, and it's clearly not a pile of sand. You can add one grain at a time. Now, at some point, it becomes a pile of sand. But that didn't happen at any single grain. There's no single threshold at which it turns from some grains of sand into a pile of sand. Yet at each extreme, it's obvious. There's no sand at all. There's no pile, or there's a pile. So I think much the same way about consciousness. Yes, there's a spectrum, but yes, you can also have some systems, maybe some very simple creatures, just have zero consciousness. In the same way that a table has zero consciousness.
I think Descartes had very weird practices. Like, if I remember correctly, he used to kill animals and then collect the corpse under the bed or something, because he believed that animals are just like, you call it very goodly, like beast machines. Yeah.
Well, that's his word. I mean, he used that word, bête machine, when he was writing in French, and I use the same term, but I'm trying to basically invert it and saying that actually it's the fact that we are animals, we are beasts, that is super important for our conscious experience. Descartes took rather a different view, that it was kind of a way of dementalizing animals to call them beast machines, that they were mere mechanisms, rather than anything that had moral, ethical significance. He did have a pet dog he treated quite well, apparently. So, like all of us, he's a man of contradictions.
Yeah, then it seems then consciousness is extension of beast machine, and since it's not like consciousness comes externally from some place that we don't know anything about. It's the extension of our biology, extension of our nature.
That's what I think. But to be honest, that's one of those undecidable questions. You get into the more metaphysical views about consciousness now. Panpsychism, is it a fundamental property of the universe, like mass or energy? Imagine if that's true. If that's true, that doesn't really change very much of the details of what we've been talking about. Um, I don't think it's a particularly compelling or useful perspective. I think it is a more useful perspective to think of consciousness as a property, very broadly speaking, of the material world, organized somehow. This may turn out to be, in the end, wrong, but I still think it's much like perception itself. It may be, even if it's wrong, it's still useful to think of it that way, because it leads us to, I think, ask the right kinds of questions and do the right kinds of experiments.
If we can slowly move into another territory, which is very well discussed these days, AI. Uh, Assuming that AI can get conscious, and if we connect the idea of controlled hallucination, would AI systems learn to agree with our hallucinations, or can they open a window to the reality that we cannot perceive?
Well, I think AI is super interesting in many ways. And of course, it's changing very fast and is the topic of much discussion here. But I do not think that AI as we currently have it is on the path to consciousness. Now, I don't know for sure that it isn't, but I am very skeptical of the views that AI or language models, AI in general, language models in particular, are conscious or will be anytime soon. Um, I rather think that when we perceive AI systems, language models as being conscious, this is a reflection of our own psychological biases, rather than an insight into what's actually happening. I think a deeper problem is that there's been an assumption very broadly held, which is that what matters in the brain, the biological brain, for mind and for consciousness, is adequately captured at the level of algorithm and computation. Um, and I think this is just almost certainly not true. um, the idea of the brain as something that is in the business of doing the right kind of computation, this is a very useful perspective on the brain. But it's also a kind of, it's been a useful metaphor for a long time. It's not the thing itself. Thinking of the brain as being only about computation and algorithm means sort of abstracting away from a lot of the messy neurobiological detail and a lot of the other properties that brains have that algorithms don't. Now, algorithms map one bunch of numbers to another bunch of numbers. Brains have all kinds of things that exceed that. They can, of course, be modeled or simulated this way, but that's sort of irrelevant. We can model or simulate anything. It doesn't mean that computation is inherent to the thing being simulated. When we simulate a rainstorm, We know that we're just building a computational model of it. We don't think we're recreating the rainstorm in any substantive way. But when we model the brain computationally, there can be this assumption that in this case the model, the simulation is the thing. And that's based on the idea that the computation is what matters. So it gets a little nuanced, but fundamentally I think the brain is doing more than just implementing algorithms. And here's the bet again, that actually some of these things are necessary for consciousness. So we touched on this earlier, thinking about life as being this thing that's out of equilibrium with its environment. And that story is one way to think of how and why consciousness is closely related to our nature as living systems that resist this sort of drive to entropic sameness. And again, that's very different from a computer, which doesn't do that kind of thing, which is actually why AI is so energetically expensive, because it tries to pretend the second law of thermodynamics doesn't exist, keep the ones and the zeros forever and ever. So this has been a bit of a long answer, but I'm incredibly suspicious of the idea that AI can be conscious.
Yeah. How have your views on AI changed? For example, let's say, do you still have the same ideas that you hold 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or have they changed?
They've changed. I think fundamentally, it's not that I've gone from thinking AI could be conscious to now thinking that it can't be. I think I've always been suspicious, but the views have certainly sharpened with the rise of the current wave of AI. And one thing that's changed, I think it surprised pretty much anyone working in the field or in related areas, how good AI systems can be at doing things. And also simultaneously how bad. I mean, I think it's just it's just this uncontrolled wave of brilliance and terribleness that AI is unleashing upon the planet. But the sheer potential for capability is very, very impressive. I don't think many people would have predicted the ability to converse fluently with a computer being at the level it now is. And now we kind of already just sort of take it for granted. Yeah, we can do this. So that does provoke. It certainly puts pressure on like, okay, so because an easy response to AI not being conscious is to sort of say, well, it still can't even do the things that we associate with consciousness in human beings. Now that's not such a strong argument. I still think it's not a terrible argument, because I don't think AI has the linguistic capability of the same kind that a human being has. It still trips up from time to time. But it's certainly a more tenuous argument to say that, look, AI just can't do language, so therefore it's not. I think it's a terrible argument anyway. But I think it puts more pressure on really drilling down to this core assumption, which has been in the background for a long time, that computation is what matters. And so for me, that's been the shift. It's focused me on some of these, I would say, deeper questions about the relationship between life, mind, and computation.
When you say you don't believe currently AI is in the trajectory to become a conscious, can you conceive a future scenario, let's say conscious AI, and what does have to happen? What should be the fact evidence for us to, let's say, identify, okay, this synthetic being is actually conscious?
So there's two very important questions there. Like, what scenarios could render it more plausible, and how would we ever know? So taking the first one first, I think it's pretty clear that there are scenarios where we could have conscious AI. If we are comfortable with the idea that consciousness is a property of a brain in a particular state, then the question is how brain-like does AI have to be to make consciousness more plausible? If we basically say, well, all the way, AI is now going to be basically we grow a brain in a dish and put it in a body, or basically have a child, then of course, we think, well, that's sufficient because it's basically the same thing. And how far can we get away from that? Now, there's other areas of AI which are growing in prominence now, sort of neuromorphic engineering, designing systems which are more brain-like. And this is motivated in large part by energy efficiency, trying to make these systems run more efficiently. And there are also people creating organoid-based AI systems. So these involve hybrid systems of silicon computation, but also um, biological neurons grown, in a lab. Um, Now, I think I'm much more worried about the prospect of consciousness arising in organoid-based systems, which are made out of the same stuff, than I am in the next iteration of language models. Um, and there's a very simple reason for this, which is that when we think about organoids, like a whole one major area of disagreement goes away. So there are people who think the material doesn't matter. These would be your computationalists. Silicon can do computation. If the computation is all that matters, well, silicon's very, very well equipped for doing computation. So why not conscious AI? Or those people, more like me, who think, no, what we're made of does matter. And we have to, just as the computationalists need to justify better their view that computation is all that matters, I also have to come up with positive reasons for why the substrate, the material, matters too. But if we think about organoids, it kind of doesn't matter who's right because we have the same material. So when you have this amount of disagreement and you can take that off the table, then I think just rationally, your credence in the possibility of consciousness should increase.
What do you think about simulation theory? I interviewed another person recently, Roman Yampolsky. He believes that we are inside a simulation. Sometimes when I contemplate myself, even recently, we have all these. We can create basically fake video, and every day, like AI generated video, every day it becomes even more difficult to identify what is real video, what's not real video. So if we extend this to the future, can we make an argument and say, with the given trajectory for the future, we may actually end up creating simulations. And if we end up doing that, maybe we are living inside one already.
Yeah, I don't buy that argument at all. I must say. I mean, it's true indeed that we are able to generate things with increasing appearance of reality these days. And it's also true that I think our perceptual experience here and now is a kind of construction. It is a kind of model already. But do we exist inside a computer simulation? I think this is. I'm surprised this idea still continues to be taken somewhat seriously. Maybe more so by Silicon Valley tech entrepreneurs than others, but still, it's taken seriously. The big assumption, or there's many big assumptions on simulation theory, but the one thing that is necessary for it to be coherent is you have to already accept that consciousness is fundamentally computational. Without that, then even if our ancestors did develop large simulations, or our descendants developed large simulations of their ancestors, the entities, the agents within this simulation, wouldn't experience anything if it's a simulation and if consciousness is not computational. And I think, I don't think it is, but I don't want to be dogmatic about that either. I just think it's a huge assumption to rest a prospect like simulation theory on. So I don't know. And I also find it's odd because it tries to assign probabilities to things which really are very difficult to assign probabilities to. So I don't find it a very compelling argument at all, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it's the question is how can you even test it? And even when you assign probability, it has to be grounded on some past number
Yeah.
to probability to be somewhat accurate.
Yeah, I mean, it's not basically it's not something I worry about. I think there are many more important things to worry about, but I really think more attention has to be paid to this key idea of what you know. And this is a question for physicists as well, because there are certain physicists that basically would say it from bit computation is primary and so on. But there are all different kinds of computation as well, um, and getting more clarity on that question, I think, would be very useful in yeah, and basically how we consider some of these more outlandish possibilities.
How has your own understanding of consciousness evolved since you have published Being You? What are some interesting latest trends or research findings about consciousness that you find extremely interesting?
I suppose a few things. I'll just pick three. Just to be brief, one is the rise of AI. I mean, I wrote about it in the last chapter of the book. The GPT-3 or 3.5 was out then, and so I do write about it. And fundamentally, what I write about still holds today. But as we were discussing, the argument has become much more interesting since then. And the whole idea of whether the brain can be thought of as a kind of meat-based computer, I think, is something that's occupied me a lot more. Another thing I've been focusing on a lot is a consequence of or implication of the idea of perception as a controlled hallucination, which is what I like to call perceptual diversity. So we all have different bodies, we all have different brains, so we're going to experience even the same shared reality in different ways. Um, Psychologists have studied individual differences in perception for ages, but I've become more interested in sort of trying to say a bit more about this. And we've done a couple of studies, well, one big study called the Perception Census, which has been trying to understand uh, the nature of how different of shared and different features between people. And so we've got data from about 40,000 people from 100 countries, each doing a number of different experiments. So it's a very data-driven empirical project, this. But I'm interested also in the implications of it, because it just seems as though we see things as they are. So again, we have this kind of naive realism aspect of our phenomenology. And I think as we learn more about how our experiences are actually maybe in most cases related but still different, I think that can cultivate a kind of humility about our own perceptual take on the world, which might also help diffuse some of these echo chamber dynamics, which are so polarizing to society at the moment. So there's a sort of larger social motivation, but ultimately, or at least initially, the idea is to just empirically explore how human perception varies across cultures, across ages, between people. So we're also looking at people by age. And here I'm very interested in what perception is like for people with dementia or Alzheimer's. People focus a lot on cognition, on behavior, on memory. Very little attention is paid to how does the world and the body seem for someone in this state. And I think it's a shame that it's been so overlooked. I mean, it's not completely overlooked, but it's certainly not been as prominent as it might have been. So we're starting some collaborations with groups looking into, working with dementia, Alzheimer's patients now to try to approach this question, to understand what the world would be like from their perspective, maybe to use some techniques for diagnosis, prognosis, and perhaps even treatment. If you can train people to perceive things in different ways, maybe that can help compensate for some of the functional problems that occur in these conditions.
It seems that as science progresses, uh, our perceived value as a human being seems to decrease. Like we had Copernicus, who showed that it's not the case that Earth is the center of the universe, and then we had Darwin and then Freud. Do you think your work in terms of controlled hallucination, first of all, do you agree with this trend? If yes, do you think your theory of consciousness contributes to this, or do you think it's not relevant anymore? In any
I
case,
agree with the trend, but I disagree with the interpretation. I don't think it sort of diminishes our status. I think it only does if we start with a kind of indefensible human exceptionalism where we see ourselves at the center of everything. I think the trend is right. I think really not necessarily my work, but I think just the emphasis now on understanding the nature of consciousness, you know, whoever's doing it, this is part of the same trend. It's the same trend to understand ourselves as part of nature, not apart from it. And in following this trend doesn't diminish us. I think it widens our view. I think it widens our awe and our appreciation for being alive and for being part of this vast and wonderful universe.
Yeah, it's amazing if you think about like being aware, being conscious to see it, experience it. That's the only thing that matters at the end of the day. Otherwise, you cannot, if you cannot experience it, if you're just a robotic zombie, let's say, just does accomplish tasks, then what's the point?
That's right. It's simultaneously the most mysterious, but also the most familiar and the most meaningful phenomenon that there is.
What do you think about panpsychism?
I mean, people enjoy thinking about it. I don't have much time for it myself. I have a lot of friendly arguments with my friend Philip Goff, who's a prominent proponent of panpsychism. You know, I just it might be right, but I think if panpsychism is your starting point, I think you end up asking the wrong questions. You ask questions about how small conscious things can combine to become big conscious things. I'm not sure that that's the most productive set of questions to be asking.
If you think about the experience of time, how does it relate to the consciousness? Is it is it is it also related to this idea of controlled hallucination? Or is there an independent time, let's say, reality that exists without our control?
Time, I think, is one of these really fascinating areas where it's a bit like free will in the sense where we have an incomplete understanding of the relevant physics. You know, what is time in physics is changed from Newton to relativity and is still changing now. Is there an arrow of time? Where does it come from? All these questions are sort of still kind of unresolved to my understanding in physics and cosmology. And it's this essential part of human experience, which we tend to overlook a little bit too. But it's also more complicated than it seems. I mean, time, if you drill down into the experience of time, there are many aspects. There's duration, there's flow, there's sequence. And these things may be separable and they may come together in different ways for different species too. The perspective I generally have, it's the same story. So instead of taking our experience of time as an accurate reflection of time out there in the physical universe, think of it instead as a useful construction, a controlled hallucination of a very different kind. And with my colleague at Sussex, Warwick Roseboom, we've done some work on this about specifically duration, how the brain infers duration from sensory data. I think work like this, what one immediate thing about it is it immediately tells us that time is not sort of marched. Time in our experience is not the result of a clock ticking away in our heads and some inner observer looking at that clock. No.
Yeah, you have this beautiful quote in the book. You say, perception of change is not the same as change of perception. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's an aspect of it. So, if we think of time as this monolithic single thing, then the two should be equivalent. If something changes, then we should perceive it as changing. Change happens in time, so on. But we know from perceptual experiments going way back that change is something that the brain infers. It's not like when we perceive something as changing, it's not that objective change in the universe has poured itself into our minds and becomes subjective change in our experience. The brain is inferring change, and only when it infers change do we experience change. So these experiments, they're called change blindness experiments. Classic example is that if something changes very slowly and you're not really paying attention to it, like maybe the background color in a room, um, that can be manipulated by video, whatever. So in the cases like that, then we may not perceive anything as changing. Yet our perception has still changed because initially we saw it as one color, now we see it as a different color. So perception of change is not the same thing as change of perception. We also have illusions where we perceive something as changing, and in fact, nothing is changing. So the two can be actually, they can be orthogonalized. You can perceive change where there is none, and you can fail to perceive change where there is change.
Yeah, interesting. I guess it's similar to the idea. For example, so I'm getting older every day, but I don't notice it every day. It's not like I am seeing the effects. It seems like a evolutionary mechanism or something where like, every day I was focused on, okay, I'm one day older, then it wouldn't be a valid strategy for staying alive.
Yeah, I think actually I wrote about this a little bit in the book that there's this idea of change blindness can be very adaptive too. It's not that we would do better if we always saw change whenever it appeared. Um, in the same way that some visual illusions they work because it's adaptive for us to perceive things in this way normally. Um, and for change blindness, I think I make this case at some length in the book that there are good reasons why we should perceive ourselves, the self, as more stable than it really is, because that is actually part of the mechanism by which we remain a coherent self over time. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. If we predict ourselves as being stable, we're more likely to be stable over time.
My final question. I think this book that you wrote is great. I learned a lot from it, and I recommend everyone to read this. Being You. What are you working on these days? Do you have any upcoming books where people can go and find your work?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, thanks for reading it and for the recommendation. I am at the earliest stages of a second book now, and I'm excited to be doing that. Although, yeah, these books take a long time to write. So the second book, it will be at least a starting point as some of the ideas we were just talking about AI, computation, and the brain. And AI is changing very rapidly, so I want this second book to not be just here's something about the latest language model and what it can and can't do, but try to use AI as a lens to help us better understand what it is to be a human being, um, in a way that won't depend on whatever the frontier of AI happens to be. But it will be about consciousness and its extent and remit. So that's the next book project. There's always plenty of research going on. The easiest way to find out what I'm up to, I think, is the webpage, which is anilseth.com. I'm also on X and on Blue Sky.
Yeah, I will make sure to add all those links in the description. I think one of the interesting things about your book is that I think it's written in 2020, and you wrote about GPTs and language models before it become commercialized, widespread. Aspect was really interesting. And even back then, you were saying, okay, these are just language models. It's not like they are tomorrow going to take over the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was lucky that GPT was released just while I was finishing writing it, so I got a chance to at least include a little bit about this new wave of AI. AI has been around for ages, but the language models were the instantiation of AI that's really captured people's imaginations, I suppose, because we use it. It's an AI that people can interact with every day. It's not chugging away behind the scenes like most of the AI that influences our lives. But yeah, think of that last chapter as sort of it's the cliffhanger before the second book.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing your second book as well. Thank you very much. It was great talking to you today. Yeah.
Thank you for the conversation. I very much enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to my talk with Dr. Anil Seth. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on YouTube to watch the future episodes. Leave a like. Also follow the podcast on Spotify and Apple, and leave a review. It helps a lot as I grow this platform. You can also stay in touch with me in Instagram at philosophy.everyday. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.